Last time we looked at two cognitive biases, the in-group bias and the fundamental attribution error. To recap very briefly, an in-group bias is a tendency people have to find it easier to form negative opinions about people who do not belong to their group. The fundamental attribution error is a tendency people have to not appreciate that others' behavior is as much constrained by events and circumstances as their own would be if they were in their position. Now moving on to the new ones. We turn now to obedience to authority. Interestingly enough, or boringly enough, back in the 1970s, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment to see how obedient people are. In this experiment, he asked for people to volunteer for this psychological experiment. However, the people who volunteered for this were not told what they were actually doing. What they were told was that they would be, doing an experiment looking at the effect of essentially, punishment on learning. And so what they would do is you would have a person who is allegedly a learner, and they would be wired up to some sort of, zapper device, and the person who's involved in the experiment would be in the role of the teacher, and they'd try to teach him something. And the person who is supposedly learning, would not learn, they would be zapped, and then, every time they failed, they'd be zapped again. And what Milgram found is that the people in this experiment, which was intended not to test learning, but to test people's willingness to obey authority, found that the vast majority of people were willing to keep zapping, allegedly zapping, the person who was a learner. And in this case, the person conducting the experiment had no real authority. They simply were obeyed because, as Milgram concluded, people are in a way conditioned or naturally inclined towards obedience. Now because of this, Milgram concluded, and it's reasonably well established, that in general, people tend to obey authority simply for the sake of doing so, even when they believe that it is morally wrong. Because interestingly, in the case of Milgram's experiment, even though the majority of people were willing to engage in this behavior, believed they were engaging in such behavior, all of them claimed that their behavior was wrong. So even though people knew they were doing something wrong, they still did it anyways because of the influence of authority. Now in terms of the side of good, resisting this, the idea is not to be necessarily an anarchist, striking out against all authority, but when one is being told to do something by an authority, it's always reasonable to consider whether this is something you should do or not. And this is a matter of ethics and conscience, of course. This is not to say that one should always resist authority or obey authority, but rather that one should consider one's moral standards and principles when simply obeying or not obeying. Now on the side of evil, given that we know that people tend to obey authority, this is something that can be easily exploited. People tend to, obey whoever happens to have authority, and they can often do very terrible things. And history attests to the tendency of people to obey, even in the face of things that are obviously wicked, destructive, and evil. Our next bias is the overconfidence effect. This is a bias that leads people to overestimate what percentage of answers on a subject are correct, typically, obviously, on things like tests. And this occurs quite often. For example, as a professor, I've lost track of the times that I've had people come up to me and say, but I thought I got an A on this test, or I thought I got an A on the paper. And they probably did think that, because generally we tend to believe that a performance is better than it actually is. Now this is not limited just to test. This is also occurs in cases where people believe they performed better than they actually did in other areas as well. For example, a person competing on a reality show, singing or dancing or something, they may think they're doing a really good job, but in actuality, they are not. And this is a natural tendency people have to be overconfident. Now, in terms of defending against this, the idea is not to, put yourself down or automatically assume you're doing poorly, but the idea is to develop a realistic assessment. When taking a test, for example, not just say, well, that felt like an A, but to consider how one actually did. Not just that I think I did really well, but going and say, looking up the information afterwards and seeing how things really went. Similarly, when engaging in other performance, one should develop a way to assess themselves objectively and fairly. And this is a hard thing to do because typically people love themselves the most. Now, what I'm not advocating is, disliking oneself, but the idea is to be realistic about one's capabilities, to know what one has done. And that is the defense against overconfidence. Of course, one should also avoid being underconfident, but in general, that's not a problem for most people. People generally tend to be overconfident. Now, somewhat related to this is the better than average illusion. This is a tendency that people have to overestimate their abilities, skills, performance relative to others. It's somewhat like the overconfidence effect, but here's the difference. With the overconfidence effect, the idea is that one is overconfident about one's own performance. If someone says or believes they did extremely well on the test, when in fact they did not. In the case of the better than average illusion, what a person believes is that they did better than others. One classic example of this is a 1976 survey of SAT takers, in which well over 50% of the responders rated themselves as better than 50% of other SAT takers in regards to their qualities such as leadership. And various other surveys have been conducted as well, which have found similar things, that most people think they're better than average. But of course, by definition, the majority of people cannot be better than average. They can only, half the people can be better than average. Now, the defense against this, again, is not to look down on oneself, but to have a realistic assessment of one's capabilities. How does one stand relative to others? Now, to close, looking at cognitive biases, one important thing to consider is this. When making choices, people often aren't particularly rational. People are influenced by desires, fears, objectives, emotions, and interestingly, boringly enough, by other unexpected factors. For example, one phenomenon is called anchoring. This is when people link one thing to an irrelevant thing. For example, out of curiosity, researchers had people write down their social security numbers and then go on to bid in this experiment, basically engaging a bidding game. And they found, weirdly enough, that people who had higher social security numbers, a bigger number, and wrote that down, they tended to bid higher in the experiment. And of course, there's really no connection, but presumably get them thinking about big numbers, perhaps. Another unusual example, they found, supposedly, that if people are evaluating an applicant and they're given a clipboard, the heavier the clipboard, the more highly they rate the applicant, bizarrely enough, even though obviously there's no correlation between clipboard weight and applying, the person's qualifications when they're applying for the job. So this suggests kind of an interesting trick. If you're applying for a job and you get a chance to provide a clipboard, always provide a very heavy one. A final example, one thing that's kind of interesting psychologically is that when it comes to saving money, people will go to more trouble to save the same amount of money when buying less expensive things than when buying more costly things. To use an example, if there's a coupon, say, in the paper for, say, $1 off, Doritos, a person's likely to clip that, because $1 off, say, a $4 bag of chips, it seems like a lot. It's, a quarter of the price. Seems like a big savings. But if a car dealership had a, flyer with coupons that said $1 off, say, a Prius or, a pickup truck or, an SUV, people probably wouldn't clip that because, they would think, well, it costs, $25 or $15 or $30,000. What's $1? But of course, the dollar you save on a bag of chips is the same as the dollar you'd save on a car or a house, because $1 is $1. And that brings us to the end of our look at cognitive biases.